is that it's my pleasure and enormous privilege to introduce today our festival lecturer. As part of our 150 anniversary celebrations, we've actually had a series of great lectures, many of them from our new honorary fellows, but from a fantastic series of public speakers. And as with so many things this weekend, we think of the number 5, to think of those 5 brave and bold women who first walked into the College for Women when it opened on the 16th of October, 1869. And we're using the number 5 as a little bit of a motive. And so we've had 5 public lectures, or I should say we've had 4, because today is the 5th in the public lecture series, and it's the main plenary lecture of this anniversary weekend. And I don't think we could really have found anyone more fitting to invite to give this lecture, and I'm very pleased that Dame Karen Pearce has agreed to deliver it for us. I don't really think that Dame Karen needs any introduction from me. Just to underline that I like to think that a key part in her career has been her undergraduate experience at Girton. She's generous enough to say that. But actually, she's gone on to have a glittering career in the diplomatic service. Joined the Foreign Office, I think, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in the very early 1980s, and has really had a first-rate career and done some magnificent work in many different areas of the world. And she has the distinction now of being the first woman appointed to one of our most senior diplomatic posts. She is the UK's permanent representative to the UN in New York. And I don't think you can have failed, if you turn on the television or have an interest in global affairs of any kind, to have seen some of the magnificent work in that capacity that Dame Karen has been doing. So without more ado, really, I should introduce her to give the festival lecture. It's called United Nations, Parliament of Fools, or Parliament of Everyman. Let's find out. Dame Karen Pearce.
Well, thank you very much, Mistress, for that very kind introduction, and thank you to everybody for being here today, and congratulations to Girton on the 150th anniversary. I ought to begin by saying the title is slightly different for reasons that will become apparent, but it is actually the UN Today Parliament of Man or Parliament of Futility, and I'll explain why I changed it later. I have to say I'm truly humbled as well as honoured to receive this honorary fellowship and to be invited to give this speech. I think it's one of the highlights of my career to date. And as well as the Mistress, and having met Dame Marilyn yesterday, I see Juliet Campbell in the audience. Juliet is also a former member of the diplomatic service, and I see Dame Rosalind Higgins, who used to be president of the International Court of Justice. And in that capacity, Rosalind and I have had many a discussion with the Secretary General at the UN. I wanted to start by just recapping how I got here. I came up to Girton in 1978. I arrived from a state school in Preston. I was very lucky to have had some inspiring teachers, especially in my primary school, and they and my parents gave me a love of reading and of English literature. But only 3 people from my school had ever been to Oxbridge in its whole history. Neither of my parents had been to university. My grandparents had worked in a mill. So to get into Girton was, as I said last night, an absolute honour, privilege and pleasure. And I was lucky enough to apply when Cambridge still offered 4th term Oxbridge entrance. And in my view, I have to say this was a genuine attempt to improve social mobility. And I was asked today when doing an interview for the year if I thought the social mobility gap in higher education had got worse, and why was that? And if I can just make a personal comment, it was the 4th term Oxbridge that opened up the opportunity for me to come to Cambridge, because it tested and recognised potential, not polish, intellectual curiosity, not examination perfection, and a desire to learn, not an entitlement to lead. So on a personal basis, I would just like to leave those of you at Cambridge with that reflection, and I will be forever grateful for the opportunity that Girton gave me. Because I came up to read English, I feel I ought to start with a quote from English literature, and this is why the title of the speech has changed. I have to confess that Tennyson is far from my favourite poet, and I don't think Locksley Hall is his best poem. But he was at least a Cambridge graduate from Trinity, from my husband's college, so there's some connection. And speaking of powerful women, it's very good to see that Professor Dame Sally Davis is going to be the first ever female master of Trinity. And Sally and I work very closely together on health issues at the UN. Locksley Hall's a long, rambling poem, more of a stream of consciousness than a tightly woven narrative. I hope it's no one's favourite poem. I'm sorry in advance if it is. We can pass lightly over some of its passages, such as woman is the lesser man. We can attribute that to satire or irony, and we'll give Tennyson a pass, at least for the purposes of this speech. But despite that lapse, the poem does contain some remarkable visionary language and some extraordinary insights into the future. One stanza is widely seen as an early prediction of the military potential of air power. Heard the heavens filled with shouting, and there rained a ghastly dew from the nation's airy navies, grappling in the central blue. Raining a ghastly dew is all too powerful and relevant an image for the atrocities we debate in the Security Council today when we try to build a consensus to stop chemical weapons attacks in Syria. But for me, the most powerful and indeed famous stanzas come just a few lines after that powerful metaphor. Till the war drum throbbed no longer and the battle flags were furled in the Parliament of Man, the Federation of the world. There the common sense of most shall hold a fretful realm in awe, and the kindly earth shall slumber, lapped in universal law. These lines from a long-dead 19th century poet are not just of academic interest. The vision of a Parliament of Man and a Federation of the world caught the world's imagination in the aftermath of World War II. For the generation that lived through the slaughter of the war to end all wars, and then saw the even greater horrors of the Second World War and the Holocaust. For them, the prospect of a world at peace, lapped by universal law, was a truly inspiring ideal. That ideal motivated the leaders who shaped the United Nations in 1945. President Harry S. Truman carried the poem, Tennyson's words, in his wallet, and he would quote them at the founding conference of the United Nations in San Francisco. He well understood the new geostrategic environment created by the advent of nuclear weapons. The world was at risk unless it could create a qualitatively different sort of global order, one where adherence to shared rules and standards would create predictability, reduce tensions, and promote cooperation. Those visionary political leaders also understood that the two causes of world wars lay not in weapons and military ambitions only. Hatred and the diminishing of people who were other, individuals, communities, or even nations, played a large and an evil part. And after the devastation of the Second World War and the mistakes made in the aftermath of the First, they understood that this new global order had to ensure that ordinary people saw a difference in their own lives. So the leaders in San Francisco therefore put a heavy emphasis on fundamental human rights, on the equal rights of men and women, and between the rights of large and small nations. And they saw that securing these rights was as equally an important goal as achieving economic progress. The United Kingdom can take particular pride in our role in shaping the original Charter of the UN and ensuring its successful launch. The UN's first home was in London, which hosted the first meeting of the General Assembly in Methodist Hall in Westminster, while the iconic headquarters was being built in New York. And when my husband and I went to call on the Queen as I was taking up this posting, she recalled that as Princess Elizabeth, she had been present at that first meeting. The opening words of the UN Charter remain inspirational to this day. And if people haven't got the UN Charter, I highly recommend having a copy. It's we, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, to practice tolerance and live together in peace with one another as good neighbours, and to unite our strength to maintain international peace and security. No one could accuse the framers of lacking in inspiration, aspiration, and high ideals. Those ideals also seeped into popular culture. As a young girl in 1960s Preston, I was excited by the TV shows that brought this vision to life. I don't think you could today make a programme that celebrated a federation of the world bound by international law. But in the 1960s, and maybe some of you will remember, you could have TV shows like International Rescue and Thunderbirds, like ITV's The Champions, which was set in an organisation called Nemesis, in probably the armed wing of the United Nations. And then there was the more sentimental portrayal of a UN populated by mice in Disney's The Rescuers. These shows celebrated how multilateral rules-based cooperation could ensure the triumph of good over evil. But as the 70s became the 80s and then the 90s, the acceptance of the international rules-based system started to wane, and so did its portrayal in popular culture. These 1960s shows were frankly not great art, but they did inspire children like me, and I still find their echoes around the United Nations today. And we were talking last night and recalling that Delia Derbyshire, who mixed the iconic Doctor Who theme tune, was also a Girtonian, but has also worked at the UN. And when we did a party to celebrate 50 years of Doctor Who, it was absolutely astounding how many people from the 193 member states of the UN had also grown up watching Doctor Who, and how many of their children still watched it. So if you want a universal metaphor for British soft power, I offer you Delia Derbyshire and Doctor Who. Not for nothing, indeed, does the Star Trek Federation logo base itself on the UN blue globe circulated by wheat sheaves. And 50 years later, as I sit in the Security Council and General Assembly, our imperfect vision of that federation of the world, how close have we got to a vision of what could be achieved by a parliament of man and the application of universal law? Is the United Nations truly a parliament of man, or is it just a parliament of futility, an ineffective, expensive, self-regarding talking shop? Would we really not notice if, in the words of John Bolton, now the American National Security Advisor, would we not notice if we lost the top 10 floors of the United Nations? Let me start with the case against. I've said many times in various interviews, the UN has a noble purpose, but it's not fit for purpose. Since its founding, the United Nations has faced an almost unbridgeable gap between the nobility of this purpose and the ineffectiveness of its execution. Even the greatest advocates and supporters of the UN have to accept there's a strong case for reform. The UN could not stop the genocide in Rwanda or at Srebrenica. It has not been able to halt or even to slow the bloodshed and persecution in Syria and the use of chemical weapons, weapons of mass destruction, prohibited for over 100 years in international law. The UN has not been able to insist on the full implementation of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, another visionary document from the immediate post-war era, and indeed women's rights and LGBT rights are back at risk. The UN has not been able to uphold the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in full. It will soon be 60 years old, with India, Pakistan and North Korea the three most obvious countries who've produced nuclear weapons outside its remit. And whereas once it played a key role in bringing many countries to independence, including some British colonies, the UN has not found a way to promote post-independence good governance, nor transform newly independent countries' economies. It is China and India, and not the UN, who have done the most to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It's often too interested in a 1970s false equivalence agenda, perpetuating rather than overcoming the north-south divide. And it has no answer, I think, to the question posed by my former Colombian colleague, who understood that UN aid to terrorists was a necessary price of the peace process, but could not understand why the UN did not discriminate against organised crime. Now, some of these problems, it's true, is that the UN can only be as good as intergovernmental politics allow, and I think that's a valid defence. But too often, though, the UN settles for the lowest common denominator and doesn't hold member states to account. Moreover, it's no different from any other large bureaucracy. It has the flaws driven by entrenched interests and organisational inertia that affect all large organisations, public or private sector. So it needs to also update the way it runs itself and have budget and HR practices and policies that meet the need for flexibility and rapid action in the 21st century and promote its message in a world of social media and 24/7 communications. These organisational challenges will take time and courage to address, but Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General, is making very important efforts to this end. Worse, unfortunately, and far more important, is the gridlock that has descended on the Security Council in recent years. Now, to be fair, this gridlock has existed in earlier periods of the UN's history. The Soviet Union was not exactly a constructive and collaborative colleague on the Security Council for the 45 years it was a permanent member. My good friend Vasily Nebenzia, who is the Russian PR at the moment, and we may disagree strongly in the Council, but at least he doesn't get out his shoe and bang it on the table while denouncing Western imperialism. However, as we heard from President Putin in the Financial Times and at the G20, that desire of Russia's to contest the West has not gone away. For a period, however, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia played a more constructive and more internationalist role at the UN. The Dayton Peace Agreement in Bosnia was one consequence of this, as were the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda International War Crimes Tribunals. But now, however, the Security Council struggles to make decisive progress on major issues because of Russian intransigence and increasing Chinese assertiveness. Respect for the internal affairs of nation states that appears in the Charter has become cover for condoning human rights abuses, for oppression, for the jailing of journalists, for war crimes, and in some cases, for actions that may constitute genocide. I don't think this is what signatories had in mind when the Peace of Westphalia established the concept of the sovereign nation state. And it's not what the framers of the UN Charter had in mind when they agreed to promote fundamental freedoms for all. Fundamentally, the Russians and Chinese see themselves in a competition to set the rules for international affairs in the 21st century. It's deeply frustrating that the Security Council can't take decisive action to address terrible events that unfold in the world today. It debates the issue of Syria twice a month, and yet we see no progress on the ground. It's frustrating for diplomats, but of course it's deadly for the poor people who are suffering and dying as a result of inaction. And it's frustrating that the General Assembly can pass non-binding resolutions that have no impact other than to call into question the UN's value in the eyes of some of its most important members and funders. And finally, while we're on the case against, one can question the effectiveness of UN rapporteurs whose reports into domestic policy issues in developed nations often feed the popular narrative against the UN rather than achieve lasting impact. Now, of course, the UN should speak truth to power, and it should hold the developed nations to the highest possible standards, but it should build a strong and compelling evidence for its assertions. So those of us who support the United Nations and want it to live up to its inspiring ideals do need to accept, I think, that at times it comes across as an ineffective, expensive talking shop that doesn't always pick the right battles. But while this may be the perception of the UN for some, and for some of the time, it's not the reality, nor all of the time. And those of us who believe in the ideals of the UN and in the rules-based international system need to do a better job, I think, of making the case for the United Nations. We need to explain the extraordinary impact it has had, and it continues to have, on the lives of 7.7 billion people in the world today. Just pause on that statistic. The UN has a positive impact on the lives of 7.7 billion people. No other organisation in world history can make that claim or even come close. It's bold and almost outrageous, and I'm sure many will want to dispute it. But let me set out the case for the United Nations. Some examples of its critical work include the global campaign to eradicate polio, vaccinating half the world's children with life-saving vaccines in 2018, delivering food assistance to more than 91 million people across 83 countries. In 2018, the Family Planning Agency prevented over 700,000 maternal deaths and assisted 1 million safe deliveries in difficult environment. The UN plays a critical role in crisis response. It sets norms and standards, it galvanizes global action, and it leads the emergency response, for example, in Mozambique with the floods or the emerging famine in Yemen. And having created the innovative concept of peacekeeping, it has run 71 peacekeeping operations since 1948 and now has more troops under arms than the United States military. Its 14 peacekeeping missions around the world protect regions that are home to 1.8 billion people, and they do this on a total budget of $7 billion, less than it costs to keep the NHS running for about 3 weeks. Now, it's easy for politicians around the world to criticise the UN for its undoubted shortcomings, but these facts about its impact are truly compelling. But individual facts and anecdotes are a necessary but not sufficient defence of the UN today. We need to make the case at a more intellectual and at a more emotional level. In tackling the biggest challenges facing the world today, we need to explain why we need to work together more, not less, and why we need stronger, more effective multilateral institutions, and why we need more collective action in pursuit of the common good and less national action in pursuit of individual self-interest. And it's why we need more of the international machinery envisaged by the Charter's framers. Faced with the siren calls of nationalism and populism, we need to appeal to what Abraham Lincoln called the better angels of our nature, and we must make the case for collective action in pursuit of a common cause. We know this is true in economics. In the decades after World War II, world trade grew at 1.5 times the rate of growth in world GDP, and GATT and the WTO lowered tariffs and non-tariff barriers to trade. Hundreds of millions of people were lifted out of poverty, and where there were failures, as in agriculture, these were due to too little cooperation, not to too much. We have a common threat from pandemics and diseases like Ebola, and we can only tackle these working through multilateral institutions, building on successes such as the WHO. And we know it's true in security. For 100 years, we did successfully eliminate the scourge of chemical weapons, which is why the recent chemical weapons attacks in Syria are so alarming. And we know it's true when it comes to climate change, the biggest threat facing this planet over the next 100 years. As I survey the challenges that face the world today, I cannot see a single major threat that can be solved by one nation alone. Dag Hammarskjöld, the former Secretary General who died in a plane crash over northern Rhodesia in the 60s, is well known for saying, "The United Nations was not created in order to bring us to heaven, but in order to save us from hell." And it's a cliche to say no man is an island, but today no nation can afford to be a political island either. This is challenging at the UN, especially on issues that affect national security, explaining to national electorates why collective action is in the national interest. The problem at the heart of the Security Council is the veto, which is granted to all 5 permanent members, including the UK, but also US, France, Germany, Russia. Sorry, not Germany, I beg your pardon. They'd like to be on the Security Council. US, France, China, Russia, UK, US. The underlying dilemma is that without the veto, the United Nations would have collapsed long ago, and it would have suffered the fate of the League of Nations. So the UK, along with France has been working on veto restraint. We are part of the ACT initiative, and we want to ensure that those who wield the veto have to explain themselves each time to the UN membership at large. Despite the constraint of the veto, however, fortunately, Security Council has still been able to do useful work over recent years. While the tragedy of Syria can only be resolved by a great power agreement between the US and Russia, with the UN in support, the Security Council has been able to introduce a ceasefire in Yemen with a monitoring mission. It has imposed sanctions on North Korea for its destabilizing nuclear activities, and it has supported the Sudanese people through the current crisis in Sudan. It has helped bring the parties in the Colombia conflict together, enhanced the approach to mediation, improved its response to sexual exploitation and abuse, and enabled more women to be part of peace process. Every day, the 37,500 UN staff around the world, that's about half the number of employees in Disney World, together with volunteers, do extraordinary work to promote human well-being and try to offset human suffering. So yes, the UN has its flaws and its faults. It does not, and I don't think it ever can, live up to the extraordinarily impossibly high aspirations set for it in the Charter. But we are lucky that it exists. We are in huge debt to the brave staff who served in it. Over 1,200 staff have died in the service of peacekeeping operations in the last 10 years alone. So we should honour and we should remember their sacrifice. The late Kofi Annan talked about the UN being a collective endeavour that rolls some large rocks up the mountain, even if a few escape our grasp and slip back down. And I think that has to be right. So I don't share the view of people who say the UN is in crisis, but I do believe the UN may be in transition as it approaches its 75th anniversary in 2020. And I think it fair to say that the United Nations, which sits at the apex of the international system, which on the whole has kept us safe and prosperous since 1945, sits today on shakier foundations than ever, thanks to the new realities of great power dynamics. The 2020 anniversary will be seen as a milestone which will illuminate whether the UN can truly rise to the challenges of the first half of the 21st century, or whether it will slide gradually and possibly not so gracefully into irrelevance. In short, the UN is not immune from the laws of evolution. Anthony Eden made clear at the San Francisco conference his view that the new institutions are not intended to stand unchanged until the end of time. So the UN must adapt to survive. And to ensure the UN remains at the apex of the international system, I would propose 6 priorities. First, to resolve the representation deficit. In 1945, the UN had 55 members, and 11, 1/5 of them, sat on the Security Council. It now has 193 members, and only 15 sit in the Security Council. So we need to reform the way the Security Council works. Second, to identify and take action on new issues where the UN can be effective, issues like artificial intelligence and cyber. These are the transformative technologies of our time, just as nuclear weapons were in 1945. The UN needs to set standards and norms for their use that protect ordinary citizens from abuses of power. Next, ensuring that the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference in 2020 is a success, bolstering a key international treaty. This means keeping Iran in the NPT, and this in turn will depend on the outcome of discussions going on at the moment about the Iranian nuclear deal. Fourth, being bolder about asking the Security Council to investigate possible breaches of international peace and security. Fifth, working smarter with other key international actors, notably the World Bank and IMF, civil society, but critically the private sector. This will be especially necessary for the sake of the Sustainable Development Goals. These are key to addressing some fundamental problems, including the rise of inequality, but achieving the goals costs some $5 trillion a year, which dwarfs existing aid programs. So new ways of financing will need to be found, and I hope the UK, with its global leadership in financial services, will be able to take that lead. And then finally, building a genuine coalition across a range of states, not necessarily just those states that think like us on the big issues, but a broader coalition of all those states who share a common recognition that a functioning rules-based international system leads to more security and prosperity. I believe this can be done if we put our shoulders hard to the wheel. We will need to overcome the desire of the Chinese to use the language and structures of the UN to advance their bilateral interests, and overcome the baleful effect of Russian disruption. And of course, we want to go on persuading our American allies that America first is not incompatible with an America engaged in the world and playing a leadership role in international institutions. A strong America fully engaged at the UN is good for the UN, but it is also good for America. For the UK, I am after all a UK diplomat, for the UK, we are up for these tasks. We're very conscious that as we lead the European Union, the UN becomes an even bigger stage for us to be an active, independent force, and I would hope a force for good. As both that great president FDR and Marvel Comics Stan Lee have said, with great power comes great responsibility. And it's fitting, notwithstanding the demise of the TV series, that the UN has adopted Spider-Man as one of its mascots. To conclude, in the long run, pursuing the common good makes winners of us all. And I hope that those of you here today who teach the current generation of students at Cambridge can inspire many of them to pursue a career in public service, whether at the national or international level, and that you might ignite in them a passion to support and perhaps even join this extraordinary, flawed, but inspiring organisation that does so much to improve the condition of people around the world. I think my fellow English graduate, Lord Tennyson, would approve, even if he were to come back in a time machine and discover, no doubt to his chagrin, that a lesser form of man, i.e. a woman, currently represents the United Kingdom at the United Nations, the Parliament of Man. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a very interesting and inspiring talk. If I could push you a little on the question of Security Council reform, this has been going on for years, right? And it looks as if most of the permanent members don't really want Security Council reform, but obviously other countries like Germany, India, or maybe the European Union would like to have permanent status. How do you think enlarging the Security Council would affect some of the problems that you've identified?
Well, thank you for the question. I think the first thing to say is that the UK and France support Security Council reform. A seat for India, a seat for Brazil, a seat for Germany, a seat for Japan, 2 seats for Africa. The people who virulently oppose Security Council reform are not Russia, China, and the US. They're just lukewarm about it. The people who viscerally oppose it are the neighbours of Japan, Germany, India, and Brazil, which is quite an interesting dynamic. I think if you want to save the UN, you have to make it more representative. But I think we all know, anyone who sits on a committee will know, there is, in practice, a limit to the size a body can be and still have useful deliberations. And if you went up to a fifth, in other words, the 1945 ratio, you'd end up with about 38 to 40 members. That's obviously too big, but we could probably get closer to 25 to 30. What effect I think it would have, on some things I think it would be beneficial. Areas like sanctions, if the Security Council passes sanctions, they are mandatory, legally binding on all other member states. But the member states grumble with some justification that they don't have a say in whether the sanctions are passed or not, or what they might be aimed to achieve. And they also grumble that they don't have a stake in the election of the Secretary-General. And they say that when the Security Council puts peacekeepers into a country, it doesn't ask the troop contributors what they think of all of this. And those are very valid criticisms. Expanding the council will make those problems much, much easier and hopefully make them go away. So it will genuinely be a more engaged organisation. I think in the short term, though, some of the big security issues will not be easier, they will be harder. Because this issue of sovereignty, don't interfere in the internal affairs of member states. On the whole, a large number of big countries in the UN think like that. And there would be, I think, a lead-in time, a transition, until they were putting a collective good above their own fear of action against a domestic situation. For example, Sudan, the Russians have tried bitterly to oppose us discussing the current state of Sudan in the Security Council because they claim a military coup is a domestic matter. After several weeks of hard pounding, we've overcome that, but I think we get more of that. So it's a short-term, long-term thing.
Thank you. My question's a follow-on. I'm a teacher of politics at A-level in a large state school, and we teach global governance, including in that is the UN, and I'm often having to defend the UN's corner from a bunch of very sceptical students, and it takes them like about 30 seconds metaphorically to point at the Security Council as, in their view, the key to the weaknesses of the UN in general. My question for you is, talking about reform of the Security Council, in their view, apart from China, it's a club of the victors after the Second World War, and also how likely do you think actual fundamental reform is likely to take place, or is it still pie in the sky? And that's the question I want to, the answer I'd like to take back to my students.
All right, thank you. I think, yes, it is a club of the victors of the Second World War, and that does include China, but the seat switched from Formosa to China proper. I actually don't see anything wrong with that. The reason the United Nations exists is as a reaction to the Second World War. So personally, I think that's acceptable. It's more about expanding the representation rather than changing it. I think one of the answers to your students is that, unfortunately, the veto is the price of the United Nations staying in being. If we didn't have the veto, either the Soviet Union or Russia or China or the Americans would have walked away from the UN a very long time ago. So while the Security Council has not been able to be effective on Syria, there are still things it can do that are very valuable in international peace and security, and I listed some of them today. Whether reform will happen or not, the nature of the UN's decision-making processes require consensus. So as I was explaining earlier, as long as there's a neighbour of the countries most likely to qualify for permanent membership, as long as there's a neighbour who objects, that's very difficult to overcome. We might start looking at trying to change that emphasis on consensus because we won't be able, as you say, to move forward until we do. But I also have to say that the countries themselves are not bringing forward ways or lobbying in ways that would make it easy to change the consensus. So I think your students will have to wait a bit longer. But I think at the same time, reform will come. You cannot have such an important institution that basically looks the same as it did almost 70 years ago.
Thank you. I mean, first, can I thank you for giving a name check to the wonderful Delia Derbyshire. But the question I want to ask is, you've mentioned Russia, particularly Putin's statement about the irrelevance of liberal values. As I understand it, that was in the context of a sort of puff for the more populist elements in politics, which include not only Putin, but a number of our close allies, and indeed much of this country. How far do you think the United Nations can defend itself against that sort of wave of anti-humanitarian, anti-liberal populism?
That's a really good question, and the Prime Minister sought to address it in her speech to the General Assembly last September. I'll come back to that. The whole Putin thing, it's only very recently that he's decided to attach his dislike of Western liberalism to multiculturalism and populism. He hates the first and is quite in favour of the second. In fact, the Russians generally and the foreign minister see it as a geostrategic thing. It's using values or the inverse of values to contest Western influence. And they make no secret of that. And some of what they do about human rights, contesting human rights at the UN is nothing short of despicable, quite honestly. And for a country that put the first woman into space to start deleting from UN resolutions language condemning violence against women is just shocking and has no place for a modern nation. But your question about populism is a very good one. The UN is trying very hard to take action against hate speech, to provide countries with a forum to observe and monitor these sorts of populist abuses against the other, if you like, to try and draw up what might be thought of as codes of conduct for governments in dealing with these issues, to put a lot of emphasis on countering violent extremism by trying to get into communities and aid de-radicalization. The UN Development Programme has various projects around the world that are looking at that aspect. And then other bits of the UN, as I say, are promoting tolerance and respect and helping governments. Where there are truly egregious cases, you will find the special rapporteurs in the Human Rights Council visiting and taking an interest in publishing reports. So this all is all... We don't have a universal government, therefore this is all about encouraging, but we've been able to get language into Security Council resolutions which makes it binding for countries to behave in such and such a way, and in turn that means they can be called out in the Security Council and in the Human Rights Council, and of course to their own people.
Could I ask a follow-on question? But first, thank you for your very wonderful speech. And it's about the leaching of power from national governments to the great internet companies like Facebook and so on. And you mentioned, we know what's happening. We know that the systems which they provide, the platforms that they provide, can be manipulated to affect democracy within nation states. And they are setting up their own system of adjudicating on human rights, which will mean that the courts have no input, that they decide what is capable of being published in the name of freedom of speech. What exactly is the UN doing? You said that the UN was concerned about this and was trying to control the use of the internet. Could you help?
I think in general, the rise of non-state actors, whether for good or bad, is a factor that the international system and the international legal system has not fully caught up with. So that is definitely one angle. I don't think it will replace the courts. There are others in this room who would know the detail of that better than me. But just as we don't allow, even, we don't say there has to be an international convention on drones for us to apply IHL to the use of drones. So I think something similar applies. It's a genuinely tricky issue, though, for the UN, because what the Russians and Chinese and others would really like to do is absolutely take it into the UN and have a very rigid treaty, legally binding treaty, setting out all sorts of limits and things governments must do and things companies can't do. And I'm sorry to say that some NGOs, because they look at this through a particular prism, actually inadvertently end up helping the Russians and the Chinese make the case for UN enforcement. Whereas in the liberal countries, what we want to do obviously is preserve what's called a multi-stakeholder model. So you have civil society involved, you have governments involved, you have the private sector involved, and that's true of the internet as well. Getting the balance of this right in an organisation like the UN, it takes us time to build a coalition. Not so much of people like the European Union, that's straightforward. But if you look at the emerging economies, like the Mexicos, South Koreas, Singapores, getting them on board so that we get the right balance of openness and regulation is proving very tricky, because it's a very difficult public policy conundrum.
First, I would like to congratulate you on your career, having briefly served in the diplomatic service and having negotiated in the UN a bit. I realised how brilliant you must be in order to be in your current job. Women, please don't apply neither. However, you said something that I have to say I found rather shocking. And I wonder if you can elaborate and stop me feeling grrr. Because what you said was that you didn't see anything wrong with a system still being based, 75 years later, on the winners of the Second World War. I spent most of my career in the EU, where the whole point was to bring the losers and the winners together. And the philosophy that anything about the winners of the Second World War should still be relevant, I find quite hard to swallow. But since you are an extremely intelligent lady, I'd like to understand.
I've never been asked that before. That's interesting. Okay, so I'll try. Some institutions are set up for specific purposes, and we know that the UN was after 1945. We also know that the most powerful countries in the world are the ones that are permanent members of the Security Council. Now, that is objectively true in terms of your military capabilities and your nuclear, critically, your nuclear power. It's no coincidence that the 5 permanent members are the 5 countries allowed to have nuclear weapons under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So as I say, I have no difficulty with the fact that this institution, which was set up in response to a particular set of events, should incorporate the people who brought those world wars to a conclusion, should incorporate them into its permanent structures. The deficit is that it hasn't incorporated anyone else into its permanent structures. That, I think, is the answer to your question. If you want to expand representation and have the United Nations represent the modern world, you need to expand the Security Council, in my view, and you need to expand permanent members. You're right about the European Union. Recently, the French and Germans held a twin presidency, that's like chairmanship of the Security Council, for a month each, and they held a joint one, which made the Russians very cross, and the Russians spent a very long time explaining there were 2 of them, not 1 of them. But they put out, round the Security Council, copies of the Franco-German Treaty, the very first one, which is fascinating in terms of reconciliation. And that is a good model, and the UN will try and draw on it from time to time, as will we, in trying to reconcile, say, countries in the Balkans or Afghanistan and Pakistan. But I stand by what I said. The answer is to expand the Security Council, not to chuck people off. And before anyone gets carried away, the Germans believe that there should be a single EU seat, and the best answer to that was published in Le Monde by a very irate French Foreign Ministry.
Okay, some questions at the back, because I can see a hand there. Yeah, we should. Thank you.
Thanks. So I have a comment and a question. As a native New Yorker, I grew up looking at the UN, passing it by all the time. And I was in awe as growing up as a child looking at it, and I'm still in awe today of not only the building, but also what it stands for. So thank you. My question is, now that the EU has signed one of the largest trade agreements with Mercosur, how do you see, if you've had a chance, to see how that can pose some benefits or maybe challenges to what the UN or your teams are trying to do in Latin America, or trying to save the forestry, or trying to save the environment, or trying to push more progressive issues in that region? I'm Latin American. My parents are Latin American, so it's always interesting to see different perspectives. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for those nice words about the UN. And I have to say, we have fantastic cooperation from the City of New York. The Mayor has appointed a brilliant commissioner, international commissioner, whose job is to liaise with UN missions. The UN brings $3 billion a year to the New York economy, but they are very, very good friends of the United Nations. So thank you on their behalf for that. I think I don't worry about the big trade deals that the EU does, like Mercosur, because fundamentally, the EU is a liberal trading nation, single market. And therefore, on the whole, what is in those agreements, countries are going to want to replicate, even if they change them a bit. They're not setting standards, in other words, that are detrimental to the world trading system. They may not be perfect free trade, and they may have some clauses that we ourselves might not want to repeat when we do our own trade deals after Brexit. But on the whole, these are liberal and liberalising trade agreements. The same is not true of Chinese trade agreements, for example. And therefore, I think the answer to the question really depends on who is doing the agreement. And that's not a very satisfactory answer for people in the UN who really like to look at the equality of nations. But if you take progressiveness and liberalism, Pache President Putin, as your standard, then I think the WTO supports those agreements. And where the WTO, World Trade Organization, is negotiating coalition agreements, what we call plurilaterals, they are making them capable of being turned into universal agreements later on if others wish to join, which I think is the right way to go.
Dame Karen, thank you for a very balanced overview. I am a lawyer and a teacher law at Girton. Alas, international law was essentially unenforceable in most areas except by moral suasion. You commented on some of the weaknesses of the UN. One of which might be that it looks at smaller issues as opposed to, well, maybe diverts time away from major issues where people are dying. But I just wanted to say, coming from a liberal democracy like Canada, the UN offers a forum for grievance of some minority groups to make liberal democracies strive harder to be better. But I wanted to ask you, coming from Canada, our General Romeo Dallaire, who headed the peacekeeping in Rwanda, still suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder. Is the UN making any progress in setting aside sovereignty and going in a case of genocide?
I think it's fair to say the UN is still learning lessons. It's also fair to say that, as I mentioned, the UN is at times acting as the UN, the body, but other times as a collective of member states. And so the trick in the latter, which is most of the things in the Security Council, the trick in the latter is to persuade enough member states to authorize a movement forward, whether that's the use of force or it's sanctions or it's mediation or it's some other way forward. But where I think even under the latter category, the UN can be at fault is that it doesn't call out fast enough and loud enough and in accountability terms where exactly the problems occur. The UN should have called out the Rwanda genocide sooner, even if the Security Council then prevaricated. It's not the UN's job to make it easy for the Security Council members to fall back on their national self-interest. It's the UN's job to confront the Security Council members with what is happening on the ground. This also happened in Bosnia very badly, where the UN head refused to authorize the NATO airstrikes, which is why eventually that power was taken away from the UN, and NATO now will act autonomously on behalf of the UN, but not under it. It happened in Sri Lanka, where there's a very critical report of how the UN did not flag up what was happening to the Tamil Tigers. And after that, a lot of rigor was put into looking at UN systems in these ways, and also how they report and how they report to headquarters. And something was started called Human Rights Up Front, which requires the UN to report directly to the Secretary General and the Security Council in certain instances. And this is exactly what got, very sadly, the UN representative Fink Haysom sacked from Somalia by the Somalis. His deputy, in his absence, wrote just such a letter, and the Somalis reacted very badly. Nevertheless, he should still have done that. But unfortunately, it does still happen. There's a report coming to the General Assembly shortly about the UN not flagging up soon enough what was happening to the Rohingya in Burma. So it's getting better, but more could be done.
Thank you. I'm so sorry that we are now coming to the end of this session, and I know there are many more questions, and I'm not surprised because this has been a most amazing discussion, and really for your wise words and brilliant setting out of some complex issues. I really like to thank you so much, but also for your work, Dame Karen. I mean, to have the vision and the tenacity and the energy and enthusiasm to really want to be a part of making such a complex and difficult organisation work, and to hear today of some of the really positive and amazing achievements. I think, you know, when you went through that list, you really made us think, gosh, you know, we really should pay attention to that. It's absolutely inspiring. And, you know, our theme of our festival this weekend is where inspiration thrives. And I must say, I think it has really been thriving this afternoon. So I'd like to thank Dame Karen for an absolutely fascinating talk and a brilliant session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. If I was any good at sport, which I'm not and didn't play any when I was here, but I would say that the mistress's kind words were all down to the playing fields of Girton. But as I didn't play sports, I'm just going to say they're down to the very nice gardens of Girton, so I hope that helps.